Hello, everyone. My name is Min Jung Kim, and I'm the director and the CEO of the New Britain Museum of American Art. On behalf of my colleagues at the museum, I'm truly honored to welcome you tonight for an important conversation entitled Reflections on Race and the Power of Art, which will be led by my esteemed colleagues in the field of American art, culture, and history. This discussion was first conceived in the context of a recent exhibition at the New Britain Museum of American Art, which was entitled Kara Walker, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War, Annotated. And this was a show of particular significance for our museum. It opened this January, January 2020, and it launched our 2020 20 Plus Women at the NBMAA initiative, in which all of our special exhibitions throughout 2020 and now into 2021 have been dedicated to female identifying artists in honor of the centennial of the beginning of women's suffrage in America. The exhibition also marked the debut of the museum's recent acquisition of Walker's important series, print series, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War Annotated, which reflects our immediate as well as our long-term commitment to representing greater diversity in our collection through acquisitions and accessory works by important artists. Perhaps, though, of greatest importance is the content of Walker's work. The conversations it has sparked, as well as the questions, importantly, it has raised. Each composition in Walker's print series depicts a historical illustration of the Civil War, overlaid with the artist's iconic silhouette figures that allude to traumatic scenarios of racism and violence that were left out of the official record. And in this way, Walker suggests that history remains an always fraught and an always contested narrative. It is against this backdrop of racial violence and discrimination that persists in our country that these works and this conversation are more relevant and more urgent than ever before. I want to take a moment to acknowledge and to thank the Connecticut Humanities for supporting this program tonight. And without further ado, I am now delighted to turn the conversation over to friend and colleague, Frank Mitchell, who will be moderating tonight's discussion. As many of you may know, Frank is the former executive director of the Amistad Center for Art and Culture, and he has also served as consulting curator of the Connecticut Audubon Birdcraft Museum, the New Haven Museum, the City of New Haven's Municipal Art Collection. And he has held teaching positions at the University of Connecticut, Trinity College, and the University of the Arts. Frank will be introducing our panelists, and he will be guiding a discussion centered on the themes of Walker's work and their ongoing relevance. Thank you. Frank, take it away.
Thank you so much, Min. Great to see you in this venue. Can you guys hear me? Not if you can. I also want to thank Mara. It's been a pleasure working on this project together with you. And it's really great to be here tonight with all of you for this survivor program. It's really sort of a pandemic survivor program. To have this chance to take a little time and reflect on the exhibition, Kara Walker, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War, Annotated. When I sat down with Cindy Cormier to talk about this event, there was no contingency for this at all. We did not imagine we'd be on screen via Zoom conducting this program. But one of the hallmarks of working with Cindy and Jeff is they plan really far out in advance. So there could be a correction for just about anything except a global pandemic. And I should probably stop here to acknowledge Cindy's commitment to fearless creativity in programming here at NBMAA, and all the fun collaborations she's made possible. Her welcome made it possible for me to do some really fun things that wouldn't have been opportunities probably anyplace else. So I think that legacy is really important, and certainly that energy made this Survivor program possible. So thanks, guys, historically. As Min said, this exhibition is one in a series celebrating this anniversary of women's suffrage and the right to vote. Obviously, this year has reminded us all of just how important and sometimes still contested that right can be. The year has also given us plenty of reminders of art's unique ability to synthesize issues and feelings while galvanizing us into action. And during this pandemic, when our will and our resources have been stretched to their limits, we've seen the impact on access to arts and culture. So for many reasons, this does feel like a Survivor program. And it's great to be sharing it with all of you. I hope it will be galvanizing. So Maura gave a quick rundown of how this is going to work, 45 minutes or so of discussion amongst the panelists, and then time for Q&A. And if you can load your questions into the chat, that'd be great. And of course, we're going to do a nice stop or pause at 7 o'clock for those of you who need to leave, just in case there's some hang on. Feel free to do that at 7. And we'll be making note of folks who click out earlier. I am thrilled to be joined tonight by Tom Thurston at the Gilder Lehrman Center, who's an old friend here in New Haven. Ashley James in New York these days, but also has deep New Haven connections, and Elizabeth Colomba. And I guess I'll encourage them to say a little bit more about their relationship to this work and this project when they click on, if that's okay. And the other thing I probably should note in this sort of housekeeping moment is that it doesn't look as though I have screen sharing capacity. So we may be every person on their own to getting the images up onto the screen. Although I know there is going to be some effort to try and tweet some things out or do something fun and interesting in the social media realm. But the show is online. So if people are at home kind of watching us on their computers, you can definitely go to the museum's website and click to see these images and do a sort of virtual tour. And that may be the best way to see some of what we're doing in real time. I feel like I should say any questions, but you can't talk back to me. So it is easy to underestimate the Civil War's impact on American visual culture. But this conflict's innovations include the war correspondent, or as they describe themselves, the Bohemian Brigade, as well as the embedded photographers and artists who brought so many of those images into the illustrated weeklies like Harper's. You know some of their names: Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, Tim Sullivan, and others. These artists were embedded. They spent their time sketching battles, what was happening in the camps, and the changing world of the emerging free people. Walker's intervention is notable because she, with her annotations, updates that field correspondent experience. She moves it into this period that Manning Marable has called the second Reconstruction. And we may well have moved into the third Reconstruction this past spring. And with that sort of opening for thinking about this exhibition, I want to invite Tom into this conversation to shed a little light. I assume you're unmiked or unmuted, Tom. And if you are, I'm hoping you can get us started and maybe remind us of how Walker's work and this series especially engages with history and enhances the work of historians and history educators.
Yeah, first, thanks, Frank. It's so good to see you even under these circumstances. And Elizabeth and Ashley, it's really an honor to be here with you. Yeah, I'm really interested in the conversation that she's having with this 19th century media form. At one point in talking about her exhibit, she says a silhouette says a lot with very little information, but that's also what the stereotype does. And what I want to kind of talk about is the juxtaposition between the silhouette and the stereotype historically. And by stereotype, I mean, you know, what is originally an old printer's term. A stereotype back in the day, and I guess it still is a solid plate of type. Right, it's something that has been created to kind of rationalize printing, to speed it up, to make it faster, more accurate, and that sort of thing. It was developed early in the 18th century, but became very critical to the kind of modern printing system that developed at this time in the 19th century. In the 30s and 40s and 50s, one innovation after another that included things like steam-powered presses, printing presses, and cylindrical presses. So you think of those of you who remember the old mimeograph machine, the idea that you could put lay type on a cylinder and run paper through it and very quickly print on both sides of a sheet of paper, fast, fast, fast. And this kind of, it made literature suddenly accessible to many more people than had been able to afford to buy a book or something like that. And it was really instrumental in a way in all sorts of social movements as well, including the abolitionist movement. It allowed for kind of quickly creating newspaper, kind of niche newspapers, things like The Liberator that were aimed at, you know, a relatively, at that time, a relatively small audience of people that could keep one current with the news that was happening among activists in the abolitionist movement. It allowed for printing pamphlets. And as it developed, it also, you know, it allowed for the development of illustrations that are far more complicated, more complex and nuanced than the kind of woodcut prints that that you would see in the press earlier, like in the early part of the 19th century or the end of the 18th century, where it was, you know, if you looked at a newspaper back then, it was very rare to see any kind of printed image in it. By the early 1830s, with the development of the abolitionist movement, they began to kind of think about how can we use this medium. And in fact, one of the big national crises that they set off in the summer of 1835 was inundating the slaveholding South with pamphlets and flyers and documents using the US mail that they'd quickly printed off. They'd had some wealthy benefactors who were putting money in and sending hundreds of thousands of pieces of printed materials in there with the idea that these would disseminate, would be shared, would be kind of passed around. And it led to, as you can imagine, slaveholders at the time were absolutely outraged. were breaking into post offices, seizing mail, US mail, burning it, often with effigies of Garrison and other abolitionists underneath, being burned by the very pamphlets they were sending off, and calling for an end to this, to the point of where the president at the time, Andrew Jackson, goes to Congress and says, we have to have a federal law to stop this. So, so there's nothing new under the sun. The post office has been used for political purposes and has been sabotaged well before the current moment. By this event, eventually there wasn't legislation, but and this kind of ended because of the effectiveness, essentially, of overrunning the post office, the postal service, and stamping it out. So it really was a kind of a mass mobilization on the part of abolitionists and slaveholders and pro-slavery Southerners to kind of using the mail and trying to prevent this from happening. At the same time, the Illustrated Weekly is starting to develop, so that by the 1850s, Harper's starts off, and by about the time of the Civil War, it's got a huge circulation of about 200,000 people, and mainly the draw is that it's an illustrated weekly, and this is such a new kind of phenomena for the American public. As I said, you know, a lot of people talk about the Civil War as being the first photographed war, which isn't quite true. And in some ways it's not, it is photographed, and all of those, Brady and others, you know, their photographs are kind of in circulation, but they're expensive, they're difficult to produce. So it's really either illustration from artists at the scene of battle who are rapidly doing illustrations and sending them up to New York, or photographers who are taking photographs, and then those photographs are turned into illustrations. It's quite a while before newspapers can actually print a photograph in there. That doesn't happen until like halftone photography in, I think, the 1890s, around then. So this, though, is really the kind of moment that illustrated art becomes something that the public sees, and the idea of pulling a work of art from an illustrated newspaper up and putting it up on the wall of your house or something like that starts to happen. And that kind of phenomenon that Walter Benjamin talks about in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, in a sense, this is kind of where that begins, this kind of mass production of art. Now, how does stereotype take on its current usage, you know, what we think of? And part of it is that very sense of mechanical reproduction, is that the repetition without any variation again and again and over. And even by the 1840s, you see these metaphorical uses of stereotype being used, maybe not quite in the way that we kind of think of it now, but in the introduction to Frederick Douglass's narrative, A Life of Frederick Douglass, Wendell Phillips talks about Frederick Douglass as a kind of epitomizing those self-emancipated African-Americans who were coming up to New England and telling their stories as being like a series of heartbeats. And he says that eventually we'll stereotype all these free, illegal pulses. In other words, all these free yet illegal heartbeats, individuals, into statutes, into law that will put an end to this. So even then, he's kind of using that word stereotype in kind of a weird way, and essentially saying that each of these stories, each of these experiences is of the same, which of course is very problematic in thinking in those ways. Now, the other thing I wanted to kind of just briefly mention again is the silhouette, in the way that that there's this juxtaposition between the silhouette and the stereotyped images that of the old Harper's Weekly. And to my knowledge, the oldest silhouette of an African American that I know of was taken in 1796 of a 19-year-old woman named Flora. And we know her name was Flora because the silhouette came with a bill of sale noting that Asa Benjamin of Stratford, Connecticut had purchased her from Margaret Dwight of Milford, Connecticut for the sum of 25 pounds sterling. So in a way, this silhouette is kind of a proof of purchase. And you can imagine her posing as one would with a candle and then a shadow on the wall, knowing full well what was happening. And that, I think, in some ways, to me, strikes to what I think is part of the horror that I see in a lot of Kara Walker's work, that in some ways that some of the images, I find the violence and the unsettledness of it reminds me of the way that the uses that horror now is being used to try and dramatize the experience of African Americans or of slavery in works like Get Out by Jordan Peele, in Lovecraft Country, the new HBO series, even in something like Antebellum by Janelle Monáe, which uses horror in a way to kind of put to lie the kind of pictures that you see in Harper's. And of course, Kara Walker is not taking Harper's to task for its lack of inclusion or something like that. This is a contemporary artist who's talking about the contemporary world, but the way in which that even now one could think of, say, a wedding ceremony being held at a plantation. And, for all the problems that Antebellum, the new movie with Janelle Monáe, has, in some ways it, puts the lie to that. It puts the horror to the notion of the plantation. And I think, so much of this is about kind of the way in which the African-American experience as in slavery and freedom has just been left out of the American experience. And so this isn't just talking about the Civil War in the way that story quickly becomes a kind of story of white Southerners and white Northerners in this great battle, but a way to kind of pick out the underlying kind of issues with it. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.
Yeah, you've given us a lot to think about there. Thank you. And we can come back to some of that in the next round in the Q&A. Certainly the issues of intimacy and sort of horror and sort of the parlor and what that means in what we're watching or binging right now on Netflix and on HBO. Thanks for that. Next, I'm hoping Ashley can jump in and share a little wisdom. And just to remind folks, since I don't know what everybody's fonted as, Tom is the Director of Education and Outreach at the Gilder Lehrman Center here at Yale University in New Haven. So there's more of that if you'd like. So follow him on Twitter or Instagram, and certainly check out what's happening at Gilder Lehrman when you're able. And next up, Ashley James, Associate Curator, Contemporary Art at the Guggenheim. And Ashley has done a number of great things since she left New Haven, notably spending time at the Brooklyn Museum, working on a big important exhibition that we've probably all seen. And maybe there's some ways in which she'll connect to that. It's great to have you here with us this evening, Ashley. And I'm hoping you can remind us of the ways that Walker moved into this space and the kind of reception her work has had over the trajectory of years, and sort of giving us some tools to place this piece and to think about what's happening in our lives now.
Thank you, Frank, my fellow panelists, and to the New Britain Museum of Art, Cynthia Cormier, sorry, I don't know that pronunciation, and Maura O'Shea for inviting me. So as Frank mentioned, I was asked to, I'm going to be reading from my notes in order to stay on task and on time. So I was asked to talk a bit about the reception of Walker's work, which is so rich and complex as to have kind of taken on its own parallel life alongside the work itself. Her reception is its own topic with its own criticism and its own historiography in many ways. To wit, you'd be hard pressed to read a review or article or even press release for the artist without some mention of her reception history. So I thought I'd briefly review some of the historical quote unquote quarrels that have been definitive of the reception of the work, outline how some critics and writers have come to understand these tensions, and then finally offer a few thoughts of my own. So first, a quick historical overview of this reception. Walker came to prominence in the early to mid 1990s with a series of, can you all hear me? I see a comment. Can you hear me? Okay. With a series of consequential presentations, including a show at the Drawing Center in 1994 that ultimately led to her MacArthur Genius Grant in 1997 at the young age of 28. Her work is and was remarkable both for how she depicted and what she depicted. So though in more recent years, Walker has expanded her historical scope to include present-day political subjects, at this earlier moment in the 90s, Walker established what is her characteristic engagement with Southern antebellum and/or Civil War history and their attendant novelistic, filmic, and other cultural representations. Her great innovation was the investigation of this history by way of the revitalization of the historical silhouette, which Tom spoke about, which saw its rise in popularity in the 19th century. Within the form of the cut paper silhouette, all figures, black and white, slave master and the enslaved, trees, lakes, cliffs, etc., are all rendered opaque and blackened against the white background on which they often rest, that is the museum wall. The figures themselves were and are engaged in various kinds of what I'll call illicit activity: copulation, masturbation, defecation, assault, these kinds of taboo subjects, not just for the specific historical context that she's rendering, but for contemporary fine art in general. So a number of artists took issue with the silhouettes, including, but not only, the significant African-American women artists, Betty Saar and Howardina Pindell. And as described by them and others, these issues were multifold, but they really circulated around this historical problem of the degraded Black subject and its circulation, with the operative question being, why reproduce images of Black people in various modes of distress and or engage in various kinds of depravity in general, and given the specificities of the antebellum moment, in general, and given the specificities of the antebellum moment. So Betty Saar wrote a letter to a number of stakeholders in the art world, naming the work as one among many images that constitute the field of negative representation. This ill reception of the work at the time, and to some degree still persists today, was often understood as generational and indicative of different and shifting standards of decency, or perhaps different ideas of appropriateness. So this question of whether artists can work with taboo subjects and whether a willingness to do so was in fact definitive of a kind of Black contemporary art practice that need no longer rely on an outdated mode of positive representation for the treatment of Black subjects that had influenced the discourse of Black art since at least Reconstruction. So my aim here is actually not to name this reading as wrong, but to suggest another reason beyond the generational for why that discrepancy happened and will continue to persist, I think. The interpretation of Walker's silhouettes heavily relies upon how you see and interpret those figures, those very silhouettes, as fully or at least sufficiently rendered images of people, or on the other hand, as these kinds of fragmented, semi-conceptual, semi-referential kinds of material. So for Saar and others, there is this persistent feeling and argument for reading that these figures look like actual people, particularly Black people. So within this interpretation, the picture functions on a level of realism, if not a kind of hyper-realism. So if a question kind of follows, what work are these images doing, specifically when thinking about the power relations that they depict in the context of what we understand to be the basic power dynamics that define the chattel slavery system? And that is one level of interpretation. On the other, for those who see a kind of gendered possibility in the work, that relies upon seeing these figures as conceptually fragmented. So the flatness calling attention to the kind of fictiveness of the image and thus the story writ large, and that the silhouette, both literally and conceptually, denies any detail, which renders this less a project of representation than a project that reflects on representation as such. And scale also does kind of similar work in this case. So here, rather than seeing these works as realistic works or as depictions of the past, what is at interest is processes of looking and the ways that we have come to understand this history, particularly Civil War history and or the function of race itself. So to conclude, I want to hold these various readings of Walker's work as each being situated, if not to different degrees, in very specific discourses of historical, literary, art historical, and broader visual culture, rather than falling back upon these kinds of generational divides or getting into questions of artistic censorship, which I don't think is really germane to the conversation. And of course, I'll say that one further context is the immediate socio-political situation in which these works are viewed. That is when we see the work, in what year we see the work, with whom, what else is happening in the world, all of that matters to the reception. And so with that, I think I would be remiss if I did not bring up the specific context under which we're having this conversation today, where just hours ago, we got word of the deplorable Breonna Taylor grand jury decision that is gut-wrenching, no matter its predictability. And so I want to note that this context of continuously besieged Black life is germane, continuously, unfortunately, to how we view Walker's work and the presentation of the Black figure writ large. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley, for all of that, particularly noting the ways in which we have to live and understand this work right now. And it's true, every single day, there is a new reason to go back and look at Walker's work and be reminded of why it's so important that she invested it with all the pathos and complication and degradation and titillation that exists within so much of what she's presenting us with. Although, as we turn to Elizabeth, I do want to challenge you, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. And Elizabeth is a sort of a noted visual artist and educator in collections kind of far and wide, the Studio Museum, other places. And it's really a pleasure to have you here on screen with us tonight to help us think about the work in ways that maybe push us beyond where we are right now with decisions like what's just happened for Breonna Taylor, but helping us think about the practice and how the practice has evolved and sort of where we can find beauty and joy in the struggle that Walker presents us with.
Well, thank you for all your kind words, first of all. Hello, everybody. I want to thank everybody, and I'm very honored to be part of your panel. This is quite great. So I want to share, I don't know if it's possible, let me know if it works. I am not savvy. I want to share my screen. Do you see the Kyle Walker? I don't remember the title of it, but it's here. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about this particular piece, but also how beauty can convey powerful messages. And I would say on the cover of Beauty, you can engage conversations and move people in a different way. They're able to go beyond the superficial message. And in this one, I mean, you see, I mean that, you know, the intricacies, of course, of the silhouette, which was usually used for, I guess, upper middle class families. And I want to rebound on what Thomas was saying about the the story of the slave who was, I think you mentioned about the first silhouette was found in, I guess, what was the date, 1796. And I didn't know that, but I think it gives another meaning, of course, to that particular piece, but also the idea that the silhouette of the man is in the woman. And through that, you see a little boy basically ushering a bunch of, I think, white civilians because they were ordered to evacuate under the Confederacy. I think that's the context. And what I really like about this is that the union and the woman, and you see beyond their progenitor, the kid who is in the back, and you focus on that, but you understand it's just, again, just a tool of, not a tool, a consequence of the Civil War, and not really an afterthought, and it's still the one trying to rally, it's still the one being put to work. But beyond that, it's still an incredible image of, a powerful image of the union of what Blackness can do together. And how you can focus on something else than the horror around. There is power in beauty because it can engage different people into understanding a very powerful message. I think she does that a lot into also using monumental figures. I mean, a few years ago, there was this incredible exhibition at the Sugar Factory in New York, where she, and that was an incredible experience, that show, because I felt it was almost like a microcosm of society, because you could see people reacting very differently to that monumental figure that was this woman as a sphinx. And all the children who were sugar babies, right? And who started to melt because it was in the middle of summer. And they started to melt, and that beauty became something of a horror, which was a beautiful metaphor for, the past and what she ever, what her work is steeped in. But also the reaction of people when they go to see that, that piece. So of course, some people were just they were going because it was the thing to see at the time. And some other people are going because obviously they're interested in Kara Walker's work. But also the clash of people together, of Black people and white people together at that show was incredible. Because I don't know if, and I'm sure some of you have seen the show, but when you look around the Sphinx, it was something quite visual in the back, I would say. And people were incredibly disrespectful the way they interacted with that statue, the same way they would be disrespectful of engaging with Black women at the time. And I thought it was an incredible metaphor of what can happen when you dehumanize someone and you can see them as an object. And the reaction of Black people were very different. It was very, I mean, I'm generalizing here, but it was very respectful and almost like seeing something monumental that was embodying this whole history. So I believe she, because of the horror that, I would consider maybe the sublime, she's able to shake a society or shake people to either react in a very intense way, whether you like it or not, but there's always going to be a reaction to what she does, and then that will engage a conversation, and that will engage dialogue, and hopefully make us, grow and evolve to, a better place. I mean, of course, situation like today, I don't know, but I still keep the hope alive. So yeah, that's my piece about Kara. Okay, let me enter this.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate you're pulling in the sugar sculpture and really highlighting the different responses of audiences to it. Some of the pictures that showed up during the run of that piece, I mean, it's true, people were doing things they wouldn't do to other kinds of sculpture and other monuments around the country to that piece. And it was not surprising and quite telling. And I think it does move us nicely into the discussions that we've been having for the past year about monuments and what they have to say. I'm gonna do something radical. I'm gonna thank everybody for this first round and say in our next sort of free round, everyone, you guys should unmute yourselves. Let's just all be in conversation. Can you do that? Are we all able to? Oh, good, Tom. Yes, we probably have a few more minutes to talk amongst ourselves. And I just want to encourage folks, and you've done a nice job, each of you, of bringing the exhibition and Walker's work into the present. We wanted to tweet out some references to the fountain that she created at the Tate this past fall. I think it's Fons Americanus, maybe. And obviously the sugar sculpture, I mean, people could Google those and find those as well. But there's been a lot of work that she's done recently that moves into the grand scale, almost monumental scale. She's not the only artist doing that. Obviously, Kehinde Wiley and others are sort of moving towards the same playbook and really pushing us to think about dialogue between these kinds of monuments and sculptures and the kinds of monuments that have informed our understanding of history for certainly this past century. So hopefully we can take a second to think a bit about that. Maybe Tom, you've got some thoughts about the pushback that we've seen this past spring around monuments in local places like here in New Haven, but also nationally in Charlottesville and other places. And I definitely want to get back to that whole notion of the intimacy of the material that we see here. So the silhouettes and the horror and how personal it is within families and within these relationships that we struggle so hard to reconcile right this second. So everybody's unmuted, so you can jump in.
Well, I mean, of course, the struggle over monuments has been ongoing for quite some time, but it's really accelerated since the murder of George Floyd. It's, I think and I'm sure many of you would agree, some of the work that's come out of that as taking, I think about Richmond, Virginia, and the statues that have been removed, and the way in which the community has, through art and through public art, through dance, through that, have kind of made these monuments their own. And also, of course, I think it's worth mentioning the kind of reactionary pushback of Trump and others who are using this as a way of kind of doubling down on the importance, apparently, of the Confederacy in telling the true story of America or something. The one thing that the conversation that we've been having lately has to do with having in New Haven, by kind of the city and agreement of most people in the city, removed the statue at Worcester Square of Christopher Columbus. But I think what's more intriguing is thinking about what are the monuments that we want to put up now. And as you know, Frank, with the Amistad committee, I'm also a member of, who back in '92 created the monument to Singbe Pei and the Amistad freedom fighters that stands in front of City Hall, and that at the time, and may still be, the only monument to an African person that I can think of in the US, or at least certainly at the time it was. Is that now we're going to be just this Saturday dedicating a new statue that the sculptor Dana King has fashioned to William Langston, who is an African-American businessman and entrepreneur and a leader and political figure in the early part of the 19th century. And I think it, gives causes to, how do communities think about, who or what are the things that we want to stand for ourselves? Because, the old tired thing of you can't destroy these because they're history is just BS. I mean, they're a reflection of a community's will at a certain time, a certain group in power at a certain time. They say something about a certain moment. They don't say much at all about history. And I guess now I'm thinking, like that statue of William Langston that we're putting in. So what do we want to say about this moment? And also going back to the sculpture of the Amistad members in front of City Hall. Frank, you'll know this, is that what excites me is that ever since I can remember, that statue is the gathering place for groups who are rallying against for LGBTQ rights, for protests, for all kinds of rallies. That's where you go, and I think that's something that's really gratifying to me about a public work of art, that it stands as a kind of place that people gather to speak their minds.
Great. So I just want to remind folks that we're well into the time when we would be answering questions in the chat. So if you have a question you want to ask us, thank you. There's been some nice comments and I appreciate those. If you have questions, we can definitely take those now. Everyone's going to be unmuted, so we can just be in conversation. It has been an interesting time, and I appreciate everybody wrestling with both the horror and the beauty of this work and of this moment. And I'm intrigued with kind of the references to Get Out and to this sort of genre now of horror movies focused on Black subjects that are all located in your office or in your almost fiance's in-laws home, or somewhere unexpected, sort of not Freddy Krueger, but something much more familiar and close and intimate. And it does feel like it moves nicely out of the kind of work that Walker's been doing, in which she looks at sort of this sort of intimacy and the horror of intimacy in antebellum America, and pushes us into these same kinds of questions, or expands that dialogue so that all kinds of creators can be wrestling with that in daily life, and that we can see them on our screens. And maybe there is something generational there, as Ashley noted, that sort of people want to talk about sort of the continuing challenges of race and identity kind of in a sphere that moves beyond sort of the moment of slavery, but with the same kind of horror and the same references to terror that we know and understand from studying slavery.
I just want to say quickly that, well, I was against the generational reading, but I'll need to go back to that. I just wanted to make a quick comment about monumentality, because as we were speaking about a subtlety, and then the recent fountain work, it only really struck me now that what's really interesting about Walker's turn to sculpture is that it's really almost dichotomous to the silhouettes. If you think about the silhouettes as being engaged in kind of a recessive relationship to representation and pulling back, versus enlarging and taking up presence that marks the monument. And I don't know what that means for the direction of the work into the future. I mean, there's the governing principles around kind of, you know, always being interested in this critical moment in history, but what happens as you move across these different medias is really interesting to me. And I wondered if Elizabeth could talk a bit about, I'm just curious if you're interested in sculpture as a kind of iteration of the painting practice. But if you could talk a little bit about medium, because silhouette is so obviously so critical to Kara's work, but you're engaged in a different lineage, and if you wanted to speak about that at all.
Well, I think we're very similar in the sense that we are using ways of expressing ourselves that were attributed to, you know, whiteness and precisely male, and we using the same elements to basically reappropriate whatever it is, the medium or the way we do things, to tell a different history, to revisit it, and to tell it either our way, or in my situation, just to find another angle, or to dig out people or characters that were meaningful and they're buried into the, you know, just the rewriting of it. I mean, sculpture, I think, is incredible because it takes room, it takes space, and you can only be recognized if you take space. So that's why I really love what her intervention was at the Sugar Factory, because it was monumental. You could not ignore that show. And when I went to see it, I mean, it was like line around the bottom. It was incredible and all kind of people, any age, any color. It was really interesting to see. So I think sculpture is very powerful. I would love to absolutely explore that medium because, yeah, I think it's you're making a statement, and whatever you sculpt is also making a statement. So I think that's essential. And it's, you know, whatever material you use, it's also something that is very difficult to move. So physically. So I think, yeah.
Perfect. Thanks. And here's a question from Stanley Black & Decker. Thanks for all you guys do to support the arts, by the way. The question reads, do you believe the broader national and global accessibility of art via broadcast media and social media will help or hinder America heal its race relations? And I guess that's to the panel.
Can we repeat? I'm sorry.
Sure. Do you believe the broader national and global accessibility of art in its broadest forms via broadcast media and social media will help or hinder America heal its race relations? So this is the optimistic question.
Listen, I'm going to be optimistic then. Why not? Like, you know, I would like to believe that, yes, you know, it can change things. It can, you know, I am not the best at social media, you know, full disclosure. However, I believe that it's a different way of touching different people and spread a message the most effectively in your own words, with your own way, right? Without having a middleman or, you know, some buffer. So you can really put it out there. Now, of course, unfortunately, it also opens the door to many things that might not be as positive. But yeah, the short answer, I would say, yes, I hope.
Ashley, thoughts on this one?
I think that art is a reflection of society. It's product of it. It's a driver of it. So very critical to ongoing events, conversations. But I definitely don't think that it's going to be the thing that moves us forward. I certainly believe in people, movements, protests, all of these things that are intertwined with the arts, but quite important as separate from a vision of a kind of utopic global art appreciation.
Okay. The great Adolph Reed would agree with you on that, I have to say. Tom, do you want to weigh in? Break
Yeah,
the tie?
I mean, I have to agree with Ashley that I think, you know, the best art grows out of these social movements. That it's, you know, that it isn't really, I don't know if it drives the movement. I mean, I guess at its best, it can initiate conversations, but gosh, I don't see a lot of, you know, honest conversations happening on social media these days. So I'm gonna have to, I'm afraid I'm not gonna be able to break the tie.
All right, I'll jump in and do that. I just want to remind folks of Langston Hughes and his 1927 or so essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. And he was certainly much more optimistic about sort of younger artists' ability to push or drag other folks towards something. And it was going to be a struggle, and I think it still is a struggle, but he definitely felt that art maybe doesn't lead a movement, but is certainly partnered with the movement. And that artists have that opportunity and that role and that responsibility to provoke and to push and to not let people feel too comfortable. And certainly this work that we've been talking about tonight does that beautifully. I think it is galvanizing, and Walker over her career has done that brilliantly. And as we said, those most recent pieces kind of moving from the wall into sculpture, into this three-dimensionality, it does speak to sort of like the challenges that we face and how more immediate things feel. So if it's a great metaphor for kind of incentivizing us to get out or to at least recognize the challenges that we face, even if we're not going to get out and make a difference. There's a question, I think we have time for one more before we have our 7 o'clock stop. We could stay on longer, but people should be allowed to exit if they need to. Let me see if I can summarize this. It's kind of a big one. These are all like really intense questions. It's sort of like a seminar question. It's not like an easy kind of yes, no, maybe. So the shorter question asks, should we dismiss art that conflicts with our beliefs, or is it its moment in time, I believe? I'm gonna answer that one. No. Don't dismiss art that conflicts with your beliefs. It's definitely its moment in time. We need art to do all kinds of things. The art that you turn to when you get married or when your grandmother dies is different from the work you turn to when something else happens. And we need work from all kinds of folks that can guide us and inspire us and soothe us and enliven and engage us and provoke us in all parts of our lives. And there is art out there that does all those things. And the challenge is, don't just go to the stuff that reinforces and encourages and supports and kind of makes you feel comfortable. Go to the stuff that also provokes and challenges. And we should do that in all aspects of our life. And art should do the same thing. And there's so much of it out there, so much great work that's being done that can stretch you. Please run to it. You don't have to spend a ton of time with it, but at least sample it so you get some sense of what's out there and sort of where your biases and challenges and sort of growing edges might be. Anybody want to add?
I do want to add, it's just to quickly make a note that yes, and if you don't like something, I think that that's important to explore too. Actually, there's a lot to be learned in that engagement, and I sincerely hope that dislike of something or disagreement with something doesn't get contextualized as censorship, particularly when it's people who are at a more lateral power relationship to the artist who created it. as opposed to institutional censorship, and governmental censorship, which is actually how the word should be used. So I just want to throw that out there when I think about kinds of the reception of art, and not feeling like, not feeling like everything is to be acceptable to you. I think that's okay too.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So we are at 7. I guess if people start clicking off now, we're not going to feel bad. So this is our little pause. If you have to go, you should go. We've got a couple other questions in the chat. So if the panelists feel okay, maybe we'll try and answer one other, unless Maura jumps in here and says stop. There was just one that I kind of breezed through and got a bit of, and it was really about how do we, all of this has been great, but how do we push some of these discussions out so that they end up in schools, so that other audiences, younger audiences, have some sense of what this work means? How do we move this to the level of curriculum? Which I know that's a question that's sort of possibly even queued up for you, Tom, but it's one that sort of is relevant to all of us. And anybody who wants to jump on that can jump on that. This is like the buzzer round. Whoever hits the buzzer first.
I do educational outreach and work with teachers all the time, and art and music and fiction and all the arts are just a fantastic way to get students engaged, not only excited and interested in learning, but also in kind of engaging with ideas and experiences that they just don't know about. I mean, just look at the way the work of Jacob Lawrence can be used in so many different ways to talk about the history of this country. So many of the teachers that I work with, really, what really turns me around is seeing how they're using art and or having students create art in one way or another. I can't say enough about it, and I think it's so important as a way to really, what's mostly important about public education is engaging, and I think that's really a real secret to it, is like bringing in art in all its forms into the classroom.
Yes, and we should note that Connecticut now does have there's work being done around adding the teaching of African-American history subjects as an elective or more in all of our public schools. And I know, Tom, you're involved in that at some level. So there will be more opportunities to push this kind of content into or onto students' plates, in the next year or so. And I guess the thing that we can all do is be vigilant.
And I want to say, it's not simply pushing it onto the plates. The students, especially for the initiative to have Black and Latinx history in that, the students were really the ones that were pushing for that. And it's really encouraging to see students at the state assembly, one after another, coming and speaking to this. They're interested and engaged in this, and it's really coming from them as much as anyone saying, this would really be a great thing.
Oh yeah, no, the young people definitely are there. It's like we often say, they should have it, but they're often here and we're catching up. And
totally.
As it ever was.
Can we add something to that?
Please.
I just wanted to make a quick anecdotal note, because in another life I was a middle school teacher, and I actually have taught Kara Walker's work to middle school students. I only remember that right now when you brought that up. I think what is so interesting about her work is because of the many elements that come to constitute it, and just how much work she has, and the various series, and there are so many points of entry. And I have actually this kind of wonderful photo, because I of course had a projector, and so I projected a silhouette, and one of my students stood up to engage with it, and we talked about the question of stereotyping and thinking about the medium and Blackness, and this wasn't even an art class. So I do think that some of these really, she gets at some of these elemental vocabularies, discussions around what it means to depict and circulate the Black figure. And for that reason alone, I think her work is important to teach, and it's quite useful in the classroom.
Perfect. Here's a little moment of optimism. Yay. Feels like the questions are slowing down in the chat, and it's 7:05. I guess this would be a good time for us to say goodnight. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything, any final thoughts, any final comments. Again, thank you guys so much. I know this has been galvanizing for me, and I definitely will keep track of what you guys are up to next. I appreciate your taking time to do this. And certainly, given that we started thinking about this and it was going to be one thing and now it's this, I really appreciate your staying committed to this project and making it happen with us. So thank you so much for being here this evening. Thank you, Min and Maura. Thanks everybody there at NBMAA. Pleasure to see you all even in this way. And I look forward to the next show in the celebration of women's suffrage and all of our rights to vote and the struggle to keep them.
Thank you, Frank. And thank you, Ashley, Elizabeth, and Thomas. This was a rich, inspiring, and honest conversation we all enjoyed so much. And we're grateful to the humanities, Connecticut Humanities, and also our friends at Stanley Black & Decker, many of whom have joined us tonight as our real presenting sponsor for all of these exhibitions this year. And on your cue, Frank, that coming just next week on October 1st, we are opening an exhibition entitled Someday Is Now. And it will begin with a panel discussion on October 1st at 12:30 that will launch the exhibition and really continue the conversation that you have all been having this evening, addressing themes of women, art, and social change. So all of our participants will receive a follow-up email. I hope that you can join us. We deeply appreciate your many, many contributions. Thank you so very much, and have a great night.